I'd like to begin by thanking the Center for Mark Twain Studies for inviting me to talk today, and the Park Church, I'm hitting things, for generously allowing us to use this beautiful space. This talk today is based on my thesis, written in fulfillment of my requirements in honors history for the University at Albany. It would have been impossible without the help of the Park Church and their archives. I would like to specifically thank Jenny Monroe for her help. I would also like to acknowledge my advisors, Dr. Michael Taylor and Dr. David Hochfelder. I extend special thanks to my advisor in all but name throughout the process of this paper and throughout my entire college career, Dr. Laura Wittern Keller. In 1900, pastor of the Park Church, Thomas K. Beecher, died, leaving the progressive legacy of the Park Church in the hands of whoever would come after him. His choice of successors was unusual, not only in the fact that he chose two people, but one of those people was a woman. Today, I have the privilege of introducing the Reverend Annis Ford Eastman and the path that she paved in part in this church. Known as the author of Mark Twain's Eulogy and as one of the first female ministers in the United States and mother to revolutionaries Max and Crystal Eastman, her career was exceptional in its own right. She was often invited to speak on the national scale, and she was frequently published in religious and civic journals. Despite her successes, she was often viewed by those in her parish not as a minister in her own right, but as a minister by proxy of her husband, the Reverend Samuel Eastman. She had a frustrating awareness of this perception, but navigated her career, intending to clear the path for women who would come after her. Annis Bertha Ford was born in Peoria, Illinois on April 24, 1852, the youngest of 5 girls. Her father, George Ford, was a gunsmith with a violent temper and an insistence on patriarchal values so strong that all of his daughters would grow up to work on behalf of women's rights. It seems that his insistence that his daughters were lesser than, combined with his propensity toward physical abuse, that instilled opposing values to his own. It is at this point that Annis begins her political writing. In her high school graduation essay, O Femina Femina, she expressed the wish that women would buck up and be something. This demonstrates that her passion for women's rights did not emerge here in Elmira or even at her politically progressive college, but somewhat independently during her childhood. At 1870, she arrived at Oberlin College. However, she only had funds for 1 year, so that's how long she stayed. It is here that she meets Samuel Elijah Eastman, who was attending the divinity school after he had graduated with his undergraduate degree. He was a distant relative of George Eastman of Eastman Kodak fame. Men and women didn't usually attend college together, but Oberlin had already earned a controversial reputation for progressive advocacy. And this is something that the couple was no doubt influenced by later down in life. They were both productive writers during their year there. Annis published articles in her school paper on topics as varied as Christmas, egotism, and, quote, things that used to delight us. Once her year was up, Annis and Samuel began a letter correspondence, and they visited one another whenever possible. She refused to marry him, however, until he got a job offer, which he did from a Congregationalist church in Swampscott, Massachusetts. The two married on August 25, 1875. It's important to note, Samuel was a Civil War veteran, and during his service, he contracted typhoid pneumonia, from which he lost a lung and he never fully recovered. Although the couple was devoutly loyal to one another, they had a troubled marriage. As was standard of 19th century marriages, Annis was placed in a subservient position. Perhaps reminded of her father, Annis had a, quote, frustrated awareness of her own intellectual gifts, and she found it difficult to accept masculine dominance, end quote. As a result, she was prone to long bouts of melancholy. Their issues were temporarily alleviated by the birth of their first child, Morgan. There are no photos of Morgan or Anstis. They didn't reach the national acclaim that their siblings did, which is why there's no pictures here. But over the next 6 years, the couple moved twice, once to Newport, Kentucky, and then to Canandaigua, New York, and had 3 more children, Anstis, Crystal, and Max. Though Anstis seemed to have a bit of a quick temper, Max later described their life in Canandaigua as the very picture of a happy family. This picture, nevertheless, was disrupted when Samuel returned from a trip with Morgan pale and limp in his arms. A doctor determined that he had malignant scarlet fever, and by midnight, Crystal had contracted it as well, and Morgan had died. This, unsurprisingly, had an enormous effect on Annis and Samuel. For the first time, Annis's faith was tested. Max described how Annis cried to an unbelieved in God to help with her unbelief. This is a trend that would continue throughout her life. She struggled with her belief constantly. Unsurprisingly as well, her relationship with her children shifted. Annis was the brightest of the children, and he enjoyed fighting with his family members. He had seemingly ample opportunity to do so with his mother. Max describes how the two would not speak to each other for days on end, and this made a house a miserable place to be in during those times. She nevertheless had a borderline angelic appreciation for her two youngest. While Annis grew up to become a successful surgeon, he had no national influence as his siblings did. Perhaps it was the tumultuous relationship with his mother that discouraged him from following in her religious or political footsteps. Following Morgan's death, Samuel's health began to decline. He would often come home from church barely able to stand. It was at this time that Annis began writing his sermons for him. While Samuel may not have disclosed in church who the author of his sermons was, the woman's written word was still unorthodox in this church. Despite this help, Samuel's condition continued to get worse, forcing his resignation. Now given the responsibility of supporting her family, Annis decided to make use of her brief religious education and find her own parish. While her husband was supportive of this decision, the public was not. In an essay titled "Making of a Woman Minister," she describes how people would refuse to meet her eyes in public and how she overheard someone say, quote, "If we have come to that, we might as well lock the church door and throw the key in the well," end quote. Annis was paid poorly and she would return home exhausted, but she kept her parish for 3 years as people began to recognize her skill as a speaker. While this was unusual for most, her children were unsurprised. Crystal mentioned how the kids suffered when father preached, but, quote, "When my mother preached, we hated to miss it. There was never a moment of anxiety or concern. She had that secret of perfect platform ease, which takes all strain out of the audience. Her voice was music," end quote. Given that she won over her parish, despite her lack of formal theological education and their existing conceptions of her gender, her children must not have been the only people who share this idea. Word of this successful woman minister spread, eventually reaching a council of Congregationalist ministers who made the groundbreaking decision to ordain her as a minister in the Congregationalist Church. This was the first time in history that a Congregationalist council had gathered to ordain a woman, and this council was led by Elmira celebrity Thomas K. Beecher. In an essay describing the town he grew up in, Max Eastman coined the term the gospel of revolt. This was to say that when it came to convention or tradition, Elmira, New York scored poorly. Instead, it was filled with the progressive champions and was, quote, "the exact center of one of the most interesting clusters of people that American churchdom ever produced or found the room to contain," end quote. While it might seem that there is an extensive cast of characters that influence the political climate and therefore Annis Eastman's career there, it is almost impossible to continue without mentioning them. As Max Eastman wrote, quote, "I've spoken only of the Beechers, the Langdons, and the Fassets, but I could extend the list until I would believe it would show that, in proportion to the total population, the number of highly developed, sensitive, progressive, and thinking minds was larger than in the metropolis," end quote. The modern congregants of the Park Church recognize 4 families as instrumental to their foundations, the Eastmans being one of these families. The other 3 were Olivia and Jervis Langdon, Olivia and Samuel Clemens, and Thomas and Julia Beecher. Thomas K. Beecher was born in 1824 to one of the most famous families in America. His sister, Harriet Beecher Stowe, wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, and his father, Lyman Beecher, and brother, Henry Ward Beecher, were both famous preachers. When construction of the Park Church completed in 1876, Beecher became the leader of one of the first institutional churches in the country. These churches, most of which emerged in the 1880s and 90s, offered social services to their largely poor urban communities, such as concerts, lectures, day nurseries, and public kitchens. Funded by Mark Twain's father-in-law, Jervis Langdon, Thomas K. Beecher's goal was to promote, quote, "an experiment in Christian socialism," end quote, an experiment that came just in time to aid those in Elmira suffering from the Depression of 1873. Because the Park Church opened the social programs to an increasingly desperate public, it quickly became an Elmira institution, and its policies would foreshadow much of the policy changes called for in the progressive era. In 1876, the same year the Park Church opened, Washington Gladden published Working People and Their Employers, which was the first time that a nationally notable pastor spoke in favor of unions and encouraged employees to unionize. This publication marked the beginning of the social gospel, an offshoot of the theological liberalism movement that originated in the late 19th century and early 20th century, in which proponents advocated for the use of theology as the basis of structural political change. Other than Gladden, there were two defining figures of the movement: Charles Sheldon, the author of In His Steps, and Walter Rauschenbusch, the author of Christianity and the Social Crisis. Other than ideological sympathies, these three men are all connected by the fact that they were born and raised in New York's burnt-over district. This is the area of New York west of the Catskills and Adirondacks, so it's just western New York. But in this time period, it was a hotbed for radical social politics, and it was where many of the new religious movements of the Second Great Awakening formed. This, however, was not how Elmira was universally perceived at the time, despite falling well within this boundary. In his study of Mark Twain, Van Wyck Brooks provided a somewhat scathing description of Elmira as part of the upstate community. The following quote is what prompted Max Eastman to write his essay, Mark Twain's Elmira, in which he originates the term the gospel of revolt. Quote, "Perhaps you know Elmira. Perhaps, in any case, you can imagine it. Those upstate towns have a civilization all their own, without the traditions or moral freedom and intellectual culture which New England has never quite lost. They had been so salted down with the spoils of a conservative industrial life that they had attained, by the middle of the 19th century, a social stratification as absolute as that of New England itself." How then do we rectify this with Max Eastman's description of Elmira as an intellectual hub? The answer lies in something Brooks points out: social stratification. Jervis Langdon was almost unquestionably the most influential man in Elmira in the mid-19th century. He had a coal monopoly in the southern tier so large he provided coal for Cornelius Vanderbilt and had an extensive system of railroads. As upstate royalty, Langdon often got his way. In the late 1860s, the Buffalo Express exerted outrage at the coal monopoly. Shortly after, his son-in-law, Samuel Clemens, became co-owner of the Express, and, quote, "within 4 days he engineered an abrupt editorial about face," end quote. Yet, Langdon often used his wealth for good. Max Eastman described him as the most un-coal dealer and mine owner-like characters that ever got ahead in business. He helped fund the Elmira Opera House, and the Langdons were some of the primary donors to both the Park Church and Elmira College. He used his power and influence to bully Judge Ariel Thurston into letting escaped slave Judah Barber go free in open defiance of the Fugitive Slave Act. Van Wyck Brooks claimed that Elmira was an industrial town with a social stratification so strict that it could be an aristocracy. He was correct in this observation. However, 19th century Elmira had the exceptional circumstances of a king who truly wanted to use his money to do good. The physical testament to his will to do good with his money stands here today, right across from where his mansion used to stand. This is the environment in which the decision to ordain Annis Eastman was made. While it might be easy to simplify the decision to ordain a woman in a time where that was uncustomary to the militantly progressive area in which the ordination took place, it was more complicated than that. Jervis Langdon, although personally progressive, was a railroad tycoon and political boss with the ability to operate extra-legally if he felt the need. Thomas K. Beecher, although partially responsible for creating the non-traditional and forward-thinking church that Annis would go on to lead, was in the palm of this tycoon. The burnt-over district, including Elmira, has a tradition of radical change. It could be easy to reduce Annis's ordination as a continuation of this tradition. It seems more plausible that it was a result of the unusual combination of tradition married with a personally progressive political boss. In November of 1889, Beecher gathered a council of congregational ministers to ordain Annis Ford Eastman into the ministry. While Annis Eastman may not have been the first ordained female minister in New York, she still became a first. Reverend Eastman's career and influences on her parishes would have been notable regardless of whether she was first, second, or last. But Annis Eastman was the first woman whose ordination was acknowledged by the Congregationalist Church. While Antoinette Brown Blackwell, the first ordained woman in the United States, was a Congregationalist and was ordained decades before Eastman, the Congregational clergy was hesitant to ordain women, so she was ordained by a Methodist minister. This is an attitude that Beecher himself was guilty of. When speaking to a friend on the subject, he claimed that if allowed, women would seek ordination, quote, in order to get to the pulpit where they can talk, end quote. Beecher's biographer, Myra C. Glenn, proposed that his attitude changed in part because of the similarities between himself and his wife, and Annis and Samuel. Quote, like Samuel Eastman, Beecher increasingly suffered from ill health and found it difficult to fulfill his ministerial duties. Fortunately for him and Park Church, Julia Beecher remained in excellent health and played an increasingly large role in running the Sunday school and other church activities, end quote. Because Julia had taken on such a productive role in running the church, Beecher understood the role of a wife as supplementary to the husband, including when it came to any career work. Therefore, he likely saw Annis first as a dutiful woman going to extremes to help her husband. If Annis had been preaching independently and was not one half of a heterosexual unit, Beecher likely would not have considered her for ordination in the first place. However, because she was working to aid her sickly husband and support her family, Beecher was able to see parallels in his own life and listen to her speak. Her skills as an orator, however, are what encouraged him to make the Eastmans his associate pastors later down the line. Again, this demonstrates that Annis's career was not a result of people intentionally advancing the role of women or operating with progressive intentions. While Blackwell's ordination was more a result of progressive ideals, she only remained in the ministry for 1 year. Annis's career would last until her death. Her career may have been able to flourish for so long because she was not seen as a minister in her own right. Instead, she was seen as a wife who was going to extremes to fulfill her responsibilities to her husband. While her ordination broke some of the boundaries placed in front of women, it did so in a way that reinforced others. Annis found these expectations stifling and incredibly frustrating. Notably, Samuel shared her opinions about the role of women in society. He voiced opinions in favor of divorce, equal work opportunities, and equal pay. Though Annis was discontented with the social standard, it seems that the standard did not completely follow her to her home life. It's also important to note that, although frustrating for Annis, the social standards established within the cult of domesticity are what allowed for her ordination in the first place. Though neither Annis nor Samuel thought of her that way, members of the council who ordained her believed her to be a helpmeet of the most extreme variety. Nevertheless, Beecher's personal inclinations alone would not have been enough to convince an entire denomination to change its philosophy. Beecher's own words can help to explain possible reasons behind this change of heart. In 1870, Beecher delivered a series of speeches in which he defined and reflected on the various denominations of the Christian church. He saw the small size of a congregational church to be an advantage, though his sermons attracted thousands. The fact that there was a less strict institutional authority means that Congregationalists were able to be more flexible in their interpretation of religious texts. He goes on to say that any changes within the larger denominations should be tested out within the smaller venue. Quote, all doubtful ventures and experiments should be tried by Congregationists first, as little boats go ahead of great ships to make soundings and buoy out the channel, end quote. A female minister was an uncustomary concept in the late 19th century, but by Beecher's account, a congregational church seemed like the best place to do a trial run. It was not long after this that Beecher would go on to ordain Annis Eastman. A council of ministers gathered in Brockton, New York, and ordained Annis Ford Eastman into the Congregationalist Church in 1889. This decision seemingly worked out very well for them, as their first female champion gained a good name for herself swiftly. On January 31st, 1891, Annis signed a 1-year contract with West Bloomfield's Congregational Church, a small church near Rochester. She was to be paid $800 for the year with a parsonage provided. Bloomfield found themselves very happy with their reverend, however, and Annis stayed in Bloomfield for years. During her time there, her reputation as a speaker and philosopher grew rapidly. By 1893, Annis had gained enough national acclaim that she was invited to speak at the Congress of Women in Chicago. She was introduced by Susan B. Anthony, who called Annis the movement's main Orthodox woman minister. The last time the two had met, Annis was still in high school and was introducing Anthony before a speech. Decades later, their roles had switched. Her speech at the Congress of Women, The Home and Its Foundations, emphasized how the sexes are dependent on one another, but the way that society is structured prevents this cooperation. Instead, she said sarcastically that, quote, marriage is the foundation of the home, marriage and the long-continued infancy and helplessness of man, end quote. She went on to question the foundations of marriage as an institution and the argument that men assume the dominant position in a domestic relationship because male animals are often stronger and more vigorous. She responds by saying that, quote, a species of spider has been discovered of which the female devours her consort when he is of no further use to her. These things prove nothing. Our progress is away from nature. What is natural in this sense is not the best, end quote. She extends her speech to the role of children in the house and encouraged parents not to have double standards for their children. Quote, there must not be two standards of conduct in the home, one seemly for the little boy, unseemly for the little girl. The same social verdict must be pronounced against sinners, end quote. Though the term was to be coined decades later, Annis here argues against the cult of domesticity. Not only was the lack of division of domestic labor unfair for adult women, but the standard that young girls are held to is also unrealistic and unattainable. In the speech, however, Annis used her societal role within the cult to her advantage. Though disheartened by a woman's position in the late 19th century, she was able to use it to establish her ethos. Who would know better about what is good and fair for children than those who are solely responsible for their upbringing? Though this was not the case in her own home, the audience had no way of knowing that, which likely served as a tool to give her points legitimacy. Only a few months later, Annis returned to Chicago, as she was invited to speak at the World Parliaments of Religions. She took this opportunity to speak on the influence of religion on women. While Eastman was not the only woman who spoke, she was the only person at the multiple-day-long conference to focus her talk on women. This speech also reveals some of the early seeds of possible religious skepticism. Her speech focuses on the fact that most popular organized religion teach, quote, the headship of man that involves, in some measure and degree, the subjugation of woman and her consequent inferiority, end quote. She traces through religious history, moving from Plato to the Vedas, explaining how, quote, religion was made for man and by man, not man for or by religion, end quote. By acknowledging that religion was made by man, she contradicts the concept that the Ten Commandments, the central tenet of the Christian faith, were delivered to man by God. This skeptical seed, which was planted in her head at the time her son Morgan died, would continue to follow her throughout her life. By 1894, Thomas K. Beecher was still the sole pastor of the Park Church. He had recently turned 70 years old and decided that he needed associate pastors to keep the Park Church running as it should. After brief trial runs, Beecher decided to ask Annis and Samuel if they would like to be his associate pastors. If they said yes, they would be paid $2,000 for a year and given 2 corridors of rooms to live in above the church parlors. The Eastmans accepted the offer and moved to Elmira. Crystal and Max were 13 and 11 years old, respectively. They both attended the Elmira Free Academy, an institution still running today. And although this town was neither of their birthplace, both Max and Crystal came to consider Elmira as their hometown. The early years of their associate pastorship were relatively uneventful. The first big event that Annis would help facilitate took place 2 years in. In 1896, Mark Twain and Olivia Langdon's daughter, Susie, died of spinal meningitis at age 26. The funeral was held at the Park Church and was co-officiated by Thomas K. Beecher and Annis Eastman. Twain's relationship with religion was ever-changing and relatively inconsistent. As the husband of Jervis Langdon's daughter, however, Twain would attend Park Church services frequently with his family. Although they may have met before, this is the first recorded meeting of Annis Eastman and Mark Twain. This meeting facilitated one of Annis's modern claims to fame. Other than being one of the first ordained women in the United States, Annis is remembered as the person who authored Mark Twain's eulogy. The Langdon family plot is located in Elmira's Woodlawn Cemetery, and though Twain lived in Hartford, 3 of his 4 children had died by the time of his death and were buried in Woodlawn. Understandably, Twain was to be buried with his children. Annis and Samuel had taken over as co-pastors at the time of Twain's death, so Annis took on the responsibility of writing the eulogy of one of the most famous men of her time. During Susie's service, Annis spent most of her time reading from the book of Matthew. However, she ended the funeral with a surprisingly distressing tone. She says, quote, "We pray for thy blessing upon them that mourn, and sit today in the midst of their shattered plans, seeing how many bright and beautiful hopes go out in darkness," end quote. Typical of a Christian funeral service, Beecher spoke mostly of having faith in God during a trying time. The Reverend Eastman, however, seemed to take a more sympathetic, if not despondent, tone. This may have been a result of the fact that she had also lost a child. Beecher himself had no children, but Annis was persistently affected by Morgan's death. Perhaps this is an insight as to how she felt about losing her eldest child even a decade later. It was around this time that Annis began to be published in national religious and women's journals. Her philosophy during this time is best explained in 2 of these articles. In 1896, she published her article, "The Minister's Helpmeet," a response to a minister's ideas about the role of a wife. In this article, she lists out what this minister expected his wife, and all ministers' wives, to do. Quote, "She must keep the accounts, pay the bills, train the children, and, in fact, stand between him and all the hard realities of life, so that he may be free to dwell in that upper and better air of divine contemplation in which sermons are supposed to germinate," end quote. She goes on to point out that these ministers have, either intentionally or unintentionally, gone on to create a new commandment. Quote, "6 days shalt thou labor and do all the work, nor rest on the 7th day, for it is thy Lord's, and in it he requires thy undivided service," end quote. This essay calls back to one of the primary expectations for women that existed within the cult of domesticity, piety. Instead of challenging this assumption altogether, Eastman claims here that the way worship is divided within the family, especially a pastoral family, is inequitable. Annis had a perspective on this issue that few, if anyone else, had. As a minister's wife, she knew the amount of work that was required in that role, even though her husband shared her attitude about the role of women in society. She was also a minister who came home to a spouse and children, the way that male ministers traditionally did. If she were only the wife of a minister, this article could have just been seen as a helpmeet, complaining about the role that she had been given. While the issues that Annis outlines would be fair ground for criticism and subsequent reform, it is hard to imagine that many ministers or Christian men would see this article as much other than a complaint. However, her experience as a minister helps to establish her ethos, especially when she goes on to explain what habits benefits those behind the pulpit. Not only did she believe that existing relationships between a pastor and his wife was an unfair division of labor for women, but for men as well. This idea that existing barriers that made women societally unequal to men were detrimental to both sexes had become a standard in her writing. Because the helpmeet takes care of every worldly issue, the pastor thus loses his connection to the everyday world. To understand what the average man goes through and thus become a better religious figure, she identifies that, quote, "Too much helpmeet is what ails a good many ministers. It is not more coddling, but less that you need. Face the boar, the butcher, and the baby with your wives, and then preach," end quote. This attitude is likely the result of her lack of a formal religious education. Because she only attended Oberlin for a year and never received a degree higher than a high school diploma, her sermons were all derived from practical experience. Here, she does not diminish the value of theological education, but emphasizes the fact that without the practicality of everyday life, sermons will become largely ineffective. Her language becomes more explicitly radical in her article, "Have Salt in Yourselves." While this was addressed to young girls, she used clear feminist language. Quote, "It is no longer enough for women to suffer in silence, to cry to him who seeth in secret, for the sins and sorrows of their native land and the world. The call for action has been heard, and women have arisen to obey it," end quote. Not only did Annis claim that the existing social order was wrong and used strong language to describe the plight of the early 20th century woman, but she claimed that change was already underway. This phrasing makes it seem that Annis was aware that the United States was going through a time of great transition. Though she would die before the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was passed, granting women across the nation the right to vote, it seems that Annis had an astute intuition when it came to this subject. In 1900, Thomas K. Beecher passed away. Having designated the Eastmans as his successors, Annis and Samuel became the co-pastors of the Park Church. Though his health had improved, Samuel was still not strong enough to constantly take on the duties of a reverend, so Annis primarily handled the daily goings-on in the church. She continued to write for national journals and in 1901 had a brief letter correspondence with Booker T. Washington. In 1903, Annis attended a summer school session at Harvard, studying contemporary philosophy with peers such as William James, Josiah Royce, and George Santayana. In going to this session, she attempted to, quote, define intellectually the Christian discipline which she had hitherto adhered to by emotion and will. The result was a deepening of doubt, end quote. This summer program accelerated a questioning of faith that had been consistently present in Annis's mind since the death of her eldest child. In late 1906, Annis and Samuel changed the Park Church from Congregationalist to Unitarian. This decision was largely influenced by her time at Harvard, which is unsurprising considering that Unitarianism started in Eastern Massachusetts only a century before. Though this was largely Annis's decision, it had to be delivered through Sam. In a correspondence to Max, she expressed that they would never take it from a woman. Annis was the primary speaker during sermons, but the congregants of the Park Church, in line with the rest of early 20th century American society, still believed that Samuel had husbandly authority over Annis. Though consistently frustrated by this, she understood that she would be held to this standard for her whole life. Annis saw her appointment as a step forward not so much for herself as for women who would come after her. Quote, "It will make the way easier for some better one who will come after me, for Crystal or some other beautiful girl who ought to be a minister," end quote. A few months after the creed changed, an organ was installed in the Park Church. Mark Twain came down for the installation. It was quite a large piece of equipment being installed, so many of Elmira's aristocracy made an appearance, including Mayor Zebulon Brockway. This gathering was also the first time that Max Eastman met Mark Twain. Twain was one of the most influential figures in Max's life. To commemorate the occasion, those present gathered to take a picture on the steps of the church. This photo is notable not because of who is in it, but because of who is not. Samuel, Twain, and Brockway all stand in the middle, accompanied by Langdons and organists, but Annis is notably absent. Annis was definitely there. She introduced Max to Twain. Why be excluded from the photo? This seems to be a physical representation of the way that Annis and Samuel were perceived in Elmira. Samuel is standing front and center, the face of the Park Church. Annis is excluded from this public presentation. There are no women. During their time in Elmira, the Eastmans began summering on Seneca Lake. In 1901, Samuel built a cottage on a 10-acre plot on the lake, which he called Cherith Cottage. Many of Elmira's notable families brought property adjacent to the Eastmans. This association became known as the Glenora community, and all costs and charges were shared communally as organized by Annis. Other than enjoying the lake and the upstate scenery, those who stayed with the Glenora community were there to engage intellectually with the residents. On Mondays and Thursdays, people would gather for symposiums, in which someone would explain something that they knew about, no matter the topic, and then be questioned extensively. When it came to Sunday sermons, Annis would almost exclusively read secular literature, and if the mood struck her, she would let Max preach instead. In 1909, during a summer on Cherith Farm, Max brought a girlfriend, Inez Milholland. It was during a conversation with Inez that Annis decided that she needed to leave the ministry. According to Max, Inez was ruthlessly truth-telling and shared his socialist political beliefs, but Inez is likely not to credit for this decision. Annis had increasingly been drawn toward socialist ideals, and although distressed by the state of the world, she chose not to leave the ministry and phase out her departure instead. She, however, could not escape her deepening of doubt. In early October 1910, Max and Crystal, who were living together in Greenwich Village, received a call from Elmira. As Max picked up the phone, he heard his father's voice telling him, "Your mother has had a stroke and is very sick. You and Crystal must pack your things and take the first train home." The night before, Samuel had heard his wife call for him, though she sounded as if she were being strangled. He found her clinging to the bedpost to keep herself from falling. By the time Samuel called his children, Annis had lost consciousness and would not regain it again. Her calling out for her husband were her last recorded words. This sickness came unexpectedly, as Annis had been very active in the last year of her life. During her time at Cherith Farm, she had learned to swim, and she began seeing Dr. Abraham Brill, the first psychotherapist to open an office in America. She had also been asked to become the dean of Barnard College, an all-women's liberal arts branch of Columbia University. This offer delighted her especially, as accepting it would allow her to leave the church, seemingly without abandoning her faith in God, which she had always tried to hold on to. She, however, was never able to accept this offer and never officially left the ministry. After her passing, Dr. Brill told Max that, quote, "She had so sound a view of things and so much melancholy that I did not think I could help her," end quote. Despite her melancholy, Max described how it took days for his mother to pass. He said that watching her was a violent experience and that few bodies would have fought for breath so hard as his mother's did. Her failing body triumphed over her will, though, and Annis Ford Eastman passed away at 11:50 a.m. on October 22, 1910, in her home in Elmira. She was 58 years old. The Eastmans did not believe in funerals. Despite speaking at hundreds of funerals, Annis thought that the autopsy process was barbaric. She had expressed to her family that she wished her body be burned of and disposed of as useless. Her body was cremated and her ashes were spread in Canandaigua, the same city that Morgan was buried in. Despite not living there together for long, all of the Eastman headstones, other than Anstis's, are located in Canandaigua's Woodlawn Cemetery. Despite her personal reservations about funerals, the members of the Park Church still felt the need to hold a memorial in her memory. Former Elmira Mayor Zebulon Brockway and Unitarian Minister William C. Gannett were the primary speakers. In Brockway's address, he laments not over the fact that Park Church lost a pastor, but, quote, "The disseverance of the woman from the dual partnership is especially regrettable," end quote. He goes on to say that, quote, "The union of the masculine and womanly has been most serviceable, and the loss in their respect will never be completely compensated in any single individual minister," end quote. It is clear from this memorial that Thomas K. Beecher's reasoning for ordaining Annis remained in the minds of his parish, even after he had passed. While she may have been an exceptional speaker and was primarily delivering the sermons due to her husband's continuing health issues, she was viewed not as an individual, but as half of a pair. Eulogies in local newspapers share a similar sentiment. Annis Eastman today is not remembered for any of her writings or as her status as the first woman ordained by the Congregationalist Church, but as the mother of two of the most vocal suffragists of the 20th century. Max Eastman was such a prolific writer that most of his writings are still unprocessed, despite his seemingly endless connection to 20th century celebrity. His biographer claims that there are 80 boxes of writing in his literary archive. Anyone who was anyone politically knew Max Eastman in his prime. By the time his mother died, he was known as the Prince of Greenwich Village, and Joseph Stalin once called him a gangster of the pen. While his mother never explicitly expressed sympathy with communist ideologies, Max maintained that it was his time in Elmira that put him on his political path. Annis's legacy was fully realized, however, in her daughter's career and influence. Crystal became one of the first women to attend New York University Law School. She co-published The Liberator and the Masses with her younger brother, helped found what would become the National Women's Party and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and after the 19th Amendment was passed, co-wrote the Equal Rights Amendment. Crystal Eastman is not remembered for her religious thought, but by the end of her life, Annis would not want her to have been. Instead, Crystal took advantage of the strides that her mother had made to become one of the foremost feminists of her day. From the time that she was a young girl up until her death, Annis Ford Eastman was constantly frustrated by the position that she held in the world. Although remembered by all who heard her speak as a fantastic orator and theologian, she was rarely viewed as a minister in her own right. Though she was a nationally published religious author, any changes to church doctrine had to be issued by her husband. Despite her frustrations, she knew the United States was undergoing a great transition. She hoped that her career would help to pave the path for women who would come after her, and she was successful, as demonstrated by the national success of her daughter. Annis Ford Eastman is not a household name, and she knew that it likely never would be. Nevertheless, her legacy is still felt today as women across the world continue in her footsteps. Thank you.